Okay, so complicating the effects of population control and the one-child policy and the ways in which it interacts with this generation of women is that the other reforms that are happening are both improving and altering their lives in very dramatic ways. One is the loosening of controls and the dismantling of the commune system in the countryside means we have male workers who are more highly valued using their newfound freedom to increase their incomes. They're seeking opportunities in market towns. They're moving further away. They become part of this non-registered urban migrant workforce that's working seasonally in cities and then returning to the countryside, which, as Spence notes, leaves women, elderly, and the children to become actually more stationary, to have their lives cemented to where they are in the most isolated, more rural areas of China, because they're the ones doing this subcontract labor. They're the ones creating food or providing agricultural goods in these areas where men have abandoned. Okay. A second major factor is with the creation of a more capitalist style economy, as Spence notes, there's all kinds of questions about um, inheritance and tax, and this, along with the greater ability to people to criticize Mao and the crimes of the Cultural Revolution, leads to a number of legal challenges put forward by women to the state. One is they want greater protection against party abuse, particularly because uh, selling brides. The Danwei have gone from not just arranging marriages, but just like selling them out to the highest bidder, or forcing widows to remarry, or selling younger girls at younger and younger ages to remarry. These are all forms of abuse that women are challenging through greater protection of the law. And so we see the creation of the marriage law of 1980, which is meant to kind of improve upon the law of the 1950s. And so we see a sharp spike in divorces, and this is where property and taxes and inheritance all come into play. Is because there are more assets loosened over to private ownership. That means the stakes of a divorce go up, right? A peasant family gets a private plot of land, or they get some machinery, and now women want to be able to sue once they leave their peasant husbands for a portion of those materials, for half those materials, or for some of those materials. So they're suing for joint property of assets. And then the other thing that's happening is the custody battles, because there's only one child, um, which would have happened, right, with multiple children, but now the intensity of conflicts over custody just spikes and skyrockets through the roof, right, because this is your only child. And then another issue that's really rather interesting in China in the 1980s and 1990s is that domestic abuse becomes something where both the party and women are trying to strengthen the laws, because it's not striking a wife or striking a woman is not necessarily defined as abuse, but through greater contact with the outside world, and through the impetus from below to criminalize these acts, you see a movement to guarantee women protection, even in marriage. Although it's interesting, in certain ways, um, law in China in protecting women from abuse surpasses Western countries. For instance, there's a notable case that I think Spence mentions where a wife actually is able, a husband is convicted of raping his wife, which the idea of a husband raping his wife, or the idea that women have to give consent even in marriage for sexual intercourse, is not something that we see in many countries around the world, and yet here it's happening in China. So that gives you a sense of the kind of vibrancy related to women's issues, and that even though the one-child policy in this generation is known as the unhappy generation, some of those ideas like independence, being politically conscious, those things that were ingrained in this generation since birth are giving them the means to fight back and push back against anything that would victimize them in this area. But one of the things that they're struggling with is also related to population control, is a movement in the 1980s and 1990s that's more like a campaign and not a policy, and that's the Huijia campaigns. Hui means return, Jia means home, And these are campaigns that we see in media or promoted by the public in the 1980s and 1990s that say the best way to deal with population growth and to make way for new generations in the economy is for women to return to their traditional roles in the home or as housewives. We do see women targeted first in the dismantlement of certain sectors of the economy. As state-owned enterprises are kind of dissolved or given over to private companies, such as the service sectors, you see them downsize greatly. And then also women are encouraged to retire at an extremely young age. Men are being encouraged to retire at the 50s to make way for new laborers, to make sure that unemployment doesn't become out of control. But women are encouraged to retire in their 40s. So you can imagine a woman born in the 1960s, what her life would be like. She would be, a young child during the start of the Cultural Revolution, and then a teen, and then she would experience the one-child policy as she becomes 20, and so her marriage might be delayed until her late 30s, and then, boom, career's over by 40. This is a tumultuous period for women. Where we see a lot of women trying to make way then as 40-year-olds is then to adopt new roles such as street vendors or peddlers of different wares and goods, okay? So their incomes are really, really lowered. And this is where divorce looks really, really unhospitable because men have greater access to pension systems. Men are able to keep their jobs for another decade. And so the possibility of a divorce at 40 becomes almost unimaginable. Okay, so some things then we see as a result of these changes and how they impact the lives of women is women become very much centrally focused then on what they call the three burdens, the women of this generation. They return to kind of roles as full-time mothers, and the three burdens are they're caring for their parents, the four at the top of the family, okay? They're caring for their husbands, and they're caring for their child, and especially when they have daughters, what happens is really interesting. These women, because of the frustrations of their life, the failed ambitions, spend a great deal of their time devoted education and giving resources that will nurture this generations of women's ambitions. But what's interesting is when you interview a great deal of women that are the daughters of this unhappy generation or the baby boom generation, they have a great kind of somber reflection on their mother's lives where they value many of these things, like the idea of independence or becoming career-oriented women, but primarily they also see the necessity to marry a husband who's a breadwinner, who will make these decisions. So rather than being told that they're going to be breadwinners or that they should aspire to be breadwinners as their mother's generation was, they instead see themselves as, look, I have to know that big events in Chinese history will come along. Sacrifices must be made. The daughters actually very much see the sacrifices as necessary that their mothers made, giving up their careers or being sidelined in the economy, which is really rather interesting. But then the second major impact of the one-child policy is the gender imbalance and China's aging population. Because of this 4-2-1 family structure, and because of the greater preference shown for males under the one-child policy, today it's estimated that there's some 33 million more men than women, which is similar to other countries. But because of women becoming seen almost as a scarce resource, it also means that there's been a dramatic rise again, and lucrative institutions like prostitution are now really, really profitable, and also the continued selling of brides. But along with that 4-2-1 structure, China has gone through the one-child policy from a very, very young population, where 2/3 of the population were under 30, to increasingly aging population. And that's why the one-child policy was phased out in 2015. Not because of human rights, not because of resistance from women, but because of the idea that China's population is now too old, and thus people must have more children and bigger families in order to create more workers that will care for this aging population. Because the aging population is growing really, really quickly. This is something that we see in Japan as well. And so the idea is that if these people aren't replaced by more sizable populations, then we'll have kind of an inverted population where the young are working very, very hard to pay for the healthcare costs for the rising life expectancy and the continued place that these elderly play in civilization. And that'll be a massive drain on the economy. So it's a new population problem that China has that's in part created through the one-child policy. Okay, this was a long, rambling series of videos. I apologize, but thank you for your time. And let's be sure to when we get together, either over dinner on Wednesday or next week, let's try and recap some of these issues related to the one-child policy, because it is a very complex issue. All right, see you next time.